I am your host, Miss Marple. Let's begin our journey.
The village of St. Mary Mead was, as Jane Marple often remarked, a microcosm of the wider world. One need not travel to the Orient or the Americas to witness the depths of human depravity. One only had to observe the way Mrs. Benson handled a perceived slight at the local bakery. However, it was not in St. Mary Mead that our story begins, but at Ravenmoor Manor, the ancestral home of the Derwent family, tucked away in the damp rolling hills of Westshire. Miss Marple had been invited by an old school friend, Dolly Bantry, who had insisted that poor dear Clarissa Derwent was at her wits' end and required a sensible woman's company during the Ravenmoor autumn fete. The fete was a quintessential English affair: damp grass, the smell of bruised mint, and the rhythmic thwack of croquet mallets. Clarissa Derwent, a woman whose brittle elegance reminded Miss Marple of a cracked porcelain figurine, stood beneath a cedar tree, presiding over the tea service. "It is so kind of you to come, Jane," Clarissa whispered, her hand trembling as she lifted the heavy Victorian silver teapot. "The house, it hasn't been itself lately, nor have the people." Miss Marple adjusted her lace shawl and peered over her knitting needles. Her blue eyes, though faded by age, possessed a startlingly sharp clarity. She watched as Captain Alistair Derwent, Clarissa's nephew and heir to the estate, laughed a little too loudly at a joke made by Sonia Vane, a glamorous, sharp-featured woman who looked entirely out of place in a tweed-clad village. "Nature is very consistent, Clarissa," Miss Marple said gently. "People, like gardens, often hide their most persistent weeds under the prettiest blooms. What exactly do you mean by the house not being itself?" Clarissa opened her mouth to speak, but her words were cut short by a sudden jarring sound, the shattering of glass. Everyone turned toward the manor's conservatory. Arthur Pringle, the local vicar, stood frozen near the glass doors, his face drained of colour. Inside the conservatory, slumped against a display of prize-winning begonias, was a figure. It was Dr. Julian Thorne, the family's long-time physician, and a man known for his robust health. He was perfectly still. A single dark stain spread across his crisp white linen shirt, precisely over the heart. Beside him lay a small ornamental dagger, the very one that usually sat as a letter opener on Clarissa's mahogany desk. "Oh dear," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her needles clicking once more. "The Dr. Thorne type, very much like the old gardener at the rectory. A man who knew exactly which plants were poisonous and exactly whose secrets were worth keeping." The afternoon sun dipped behind a cloud, casting a long skeletal shadow from the manor across the manicured lawn. The festive chatter died instantly, replaced by the heavy, suffocating silence of Ravenmoor. The fete was over, but the unravelling of the Derwent family had only just begun. The silence that followed the discovery of Dr. Thorne's body was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a thunderstorm. For a long minute, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the manor's hall, audible even through the shattered conservatory glass. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the village of Ravenmoor erupted into a cacophony of panicked whispers and poorly concealed accusations. Miss Marple remained seated beneath the cedar tree, her knitting needles stilled for the briefest of moments before resuming their steady hypnotic click. To the casual observer, she appeared merely a frail elderly woman stunned by the tragedy. In reality, she was cataloguing the reactions of those around her with the clinical precision of a botanist. She watched Captain Alistair Derwent, whose face had turned a peculiar shade of grey, similar to the colour of a winter sea. He did not rush to the body. Instead, he stepped backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the silver flask in his breast pocket. It was a gesture Miss Marple had seen before in young men who carried burdens far heavier than their reputations. Sonia Vane, by contrast, displayed a reaction that was far more theatrical. She let out a sharp, jagged gasp and leaned heavily against a stone bird bath, her eyes darting not toward the deceased doctor, but toward Clarissa Derwent. There was a strange, predatory intensity in that look, one that reminded Miss Marple of a cat watching a bird through a window pane, calculating the distance and the risk. Clarissa herself remained standing by the tea service, her hands still hovering over the silver teapot as if she had been turned to stone. She did not cry. She simply stared at the broken glass, her expression one of weary resignation rather than shock, as the local constabulary arrived, led by the blustering and overly confident Inspector Slack, who had been drafted from the neighbouring district. The gossip began to ferment like fallen fruit in the sun. Miss Marple drifted toward the edge of the lawn where the village choir members were huddled. "Such a tragedy," whispered Mrs. Gable, the postmistress, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and excitement. "And to think Dr. Thorne was just saying at the surgery yesterday that he had a most important matter to discuss with the Derwent family. A matter of conscience, he called it." "Conscience is a very heavy thing to carry, isn't it?" Miss Marple replied mildly, her voice barely a murmur, like a heavy parcel that one simply cannot find a place to set down. "I remember a similar case in St. Mary Mead, old Mr. Gregson. He had a conscience about his neighbour's property line, and it led to the most unfortunate business with a hedge trimmer." Inspector Slack, meanwhile, was busy making a spectacle of his authority. He cordoned off the conservatory with a vigour that suggested he expected the murderer to still be hiding among the begonias. He immediately zeroed in on Arthur Pringle, the vicar. "You were the first on the scene, Mr. Pringle," Slack barked, his notebook poised like a weapon. "Pray tell, what exactly were you doing so close to the conservatory doors when the glass broke?" The vicar stammered, his spectacles fogging over in the humid afternoon air. I was merely looking for a place to set my tea. The tables were full and I thought the ledge—" "Oh, it's too terrible." "He was a good man, Inspector, a pillar of our community." Miss Marple noted the way the vicar's hands shook, not with the tremors of grief, but with a frantic, nervous energy. She also noted something the inspector had completely missed, a small yellow thread caught on the jagged edge of the broken conservatory door. It was a specific shade of primrose, exactly matching the embroidery on the scarf Sonia Vane had been wearing earlier in the day, though the scarf was nowhere to be seen. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn, the theories began to take shape. The villagers spoke of Thorne's mounting gambling debts, a rumour started by the local publican, and of a secret feud between the doctor and the captain over a disputed inheritance. Each theory was more elaborate than the last, fueled by years of pent-up resentment and the peculiar joy small towns take in the downfall of their betters. Miss Marple listened to it all, filtering the noise through her vast library of human experience. She knew that the truth rarely lay in the grand gestures or the obvious motives. It lay in the small, discordant notes, the way a teapot was held, the absence of a scarf, or the specific timing of a broken glass. She saw the fear in Clarissa's eyes, a fear that was not for herself but for a secret that Ravenmoor Manor had kept buried for decades. As the police led the vicar away for further questioning, the village felt certain the culprit had been found. Miss Marple, however, merely sighed and reached for a different ball of wool. The pattern was forming, but it was far more complex than a simple fit of clerical passion. The real murderer was still among them, sipping tea and mourning a man they had systematically erased. The morning following the tragedy at Ravenmoor arrived with a deceptive brilliance, the dew sparkling on the lawns as if the violence of the previous afternoon had been nothing more than a fever dream. Miss Marple sat in the mansion's small breakfast room, her fingers moving rhythmically as she worked on a pair of woolen infant booties. From her vantage point, she could observe the hallway where the comings and goings of the household provided a silent theatre of human frailty. Inspector Slack had returned early, his boots clattering on the oak floors with an importance that seemed to fill the house with unnecessary noise. He was convinced that the case was a matter of simple opportunity, his mind already spinning a web around the unfortunate vicar, whose nervous disposition made him an easy target for a man of Slack's limited imagination. Miss Marple, however, was looking at the situation from a different angle entirely. She was thinking of Mrs. Treadgold from her own village, a woman who had once accused the milkman of theft simply because his whistling was too cheerful for a Monday morning. People often reacted to stress by leaning into their most basic instincts, and what she saw in Ravenmoor was a collection of people leaning very hard indeed. She watched through the open door as Captain Alistair Derwent paced the corridor. He had discarded his festive tweeds for a sombre charcoal suit, but his eyes were bloodshot and his movements were jerky. He stopped by a tall Chinese vase, staring at it for a long moment before adjusting its position by a mere fraction of an inch. To the inspector, this might look like grief. To Miss Marple, it looked like a man who was terrified of something being out of its proper place. Clarissa Derwent entered the parlour, her face pale but composed. She carried a tray of correspondence, her movements graceful yet brittle. "I hope you slept well, Jane," she said, though it was clear Clarissa herself had not closed an eye. "The inspector is being most thorough, though I find his manner rather abrasive. He seems quite certain that poor Arthur Pringle is responsible. It's preposterous, of course. Arthur wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone a man he's known for 20 years. She sat down, her hands clasping her knees tightly. "But the police like a quick solution, don't they? It makes the village feel safe again." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "The police, dear Clarissa, are like surgeons. They look for the obvious wound. But sometimes the real ailment is a slow-acting poison that has been in the blood for a long time. Tell me, Dr. Thorne was the family physician for quite a while, wasn't he? He must have known the history of this house better than almost anyone." Clarissa's posture stiffened, a subtle shift that did not escape the older woman's notice. "He was meticulous," Clarissa replied after a pause. "He kept records of everything. Not just medical records, but family trees, dates, even the various eccentricities of the Derwent ancestors. He called it his social pathology project." As Clarissa left to attend to the inspector's demands, Miss Marple's mind settled on that phrase, social pathology. It was exactly the sort of thing that caused trouble in a small community. Knowledge was a dangerous commodity, especially when it involved the Victorian obsession with lineage and legitimacy. She decided a short walk was in order and made her way toward the conservatory. The glass had been swept away, but the scent of crushed begonias still hung heavy in the air. As she approached the crime scene, she encountered Sonia Vane. The younger woman was dressed in a sleek, dark travelling suit, looking as though she were prepared to flee at a moment's notice. She was smoking a cigarette with rapid, shallow puffs, her eyes scanning the gardens. "A dreadful business, isn't it?" Sonia said, her voice smoky and laced with a defensive edge. "I suppose you're here to offer more tea and sympathy, Miss Marple. Or are you looking for clues like a character in a shilling novel?" Miss Marple chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling with a simulated innocence. "Oh, I'm far too old for adventures, my dear. I was just thinking about a primrose-coloured scarf I saw yesterday. It was such a lovely shade it reminded me of the spring flowers in my own garden. I noticed it wasn't on the coat rack this morning. I do hope it wasn't lost in all the excitement." Sonia's expression flickered, a brief sharp flash of something that looked remarkably like genuine fear. She dropped her cigarette, grinding it into the gravel with the toe of her expensive shoe. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped. "I didn't wear a scarf yesterday. You must be mistaken. The elderly often see things that aren't there, don't they?" She turned and walked briskly toward the house without looking back. Miss Marple watched her go, her knitting needles beginning to click again in her pocket. The lie was so blatant, so unnecessary, that it served as a loud ringing bell in the silence of the morning. Sonia Vane was hiding something, but more importantly, she was terrified of a simple piece of silk. Miss Marple turned her attention back to the conservatory floor. Near the spot where Dr. Thorne had fallen, there was a small circular indentation in the soft earth of a potted fern. It was not the mark of a shoe, nor was it a dropped coin. It was the distinct imprint of a heavy, signet-style ring. She remembered seeing such a ring on the hand of Captain Alistair earlier that morning. a heavy gold band with the Derwent crest. Patterns, Miss Marple thought. The village was full of patterns, and they were all beginning to converge on the same dark centre. The doctor had been killed not for what he did, but for what he knew, and the secret was one that someone in this house was willing to kill for twice. By midday, the atmosphere at Ravenmoor Manor had shifted from stunned grief to a prickly, defensive agitation. Inspector Slack had established a makeshift headquarters in the library, a room lined with leather-bound volumes that seemed to frown upon his modern, aggressive methods. He had officially detained the vicar, Arthur Pringle, though not yet formally charged him. The village was already abuzz with the news, and the consensus among the locals at the Black Swan pub was that the quiet ones are always the most dangerous. It was a sentiment Miss Marple had heard 1,000 times before, and it was almost always used by people who preferred a convenient culprit over a complicated truth. Miss Marple sat in the drawing-room, her spectacles perched on the end of her nose as she mended a small tear in one of Clarissa's lace doilies. She was positioned perfectly to hear the raised voices coming from the library. Inspector Slack was currently laying out his obvious case to a weary-looking Captain Alistair. "It's as plain as a pikestaff, Captain." Slack's voice boomed through the heavy oak door. The vicar was seen at the door. He's been under tremendous financial pressure. Donations to the roof fund have been mysteriously vanishing. Thorne discovered the discrepancy in the parish accounts. He confronts the vicar in the conservatory and Pringle snaps. A moment of madness. It happens in the best of families, or in this case, the best of parishes. Alistair's response was a low, indistinguishable mumble, followed by the clink of glass against glass. Miss Marple sighed to herself. Financial desperation was indeed a powerful motive, but it rarely led a man like Arthur Pringle to use a decorative dagger with such surgical precision. Arthur was a man who fainted at the sight of a scraped knee during Sunday school. The idea of him plunging a blade into a friend's heart was, to her mind, utterly inconsistent with his pathology. She thought instead of Mr. Beddoe, the grocer in St. Mary Mead, who had been accused of embezzling from the Bowls Club. Everyone was certain of his guilt until it was discovered that the treasurer had simply been using a very confusing system of shorthand that looked like missing zeros. The door to the library swung open, and Alistair Derwent emerged, looking more frazzled than before. He nearly collided with Miss Marple as she rose to fetch a fresh skein of wool. "Oh, forgive me, Miss Marple," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the library as if he expected Slack to chase him with handcuffs. "The inspector, he's so very certain. It's a relief in a way to have it settled, but I can't help but feel, well, it's all so sordid." He twisted the gold signet ring on his finger, the very ring that had left its mark in the conservatory soil. Miss Marple noticed that the skin around the ring was slightly red, as if he had been scrubbing it. "Settled is a very comforting word, Alistair," Miss Marple said, her voice like a cool breeze, "but nature often abhors a vacuum, and justice abhors a mistake. Tell me, did Dr. Thorne ever mention old estate records to you? The ones he was so fond of studying? I believe he called them his social pathology project. It sounds so very scientific, doesn't it?" Alistair's hand froze on his ring. For a second his polished veneer cracked, revealing a hollow, panicked void beneath. He mentioned them, just old family nonsense, genealogies and such, nothing that would interest anyone today. He turned away abruptly, his footsteps echoing too loudly on the polished floorboards. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the slight tremor in his gait. She then turned her attention to the hallway, where Sonia Vane was talking in hushed, urgent tones to the parlour-maid, Gladys. Sonia's poise was entirely gone. She was clutching a handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. As Miss Marple approached, she caught a fragment of the conversation. "Not in the wardrobe, then where? It has to be somewhere." Gladys looked terrified, shaking her head vigorously before scurrying away toward the kitchens. Sonia turned, finding Miss Marple standing there with an expression of mild grandmotherly concern. "Is something lost, dear? Perhaps I can help you find it. I have a very good eye for things that have been misplaced. It's a habit one picks up when one knits as much as I do. One is always dropping stitches and finding them in the most unexpected places. Sonia's eyes flashed with a cold, desperate light. I don't need your help, Miss Marple, and I suggest you stop poking your nose into things that don't concern you. This isn't a village fete anymore. A man is dead. Precisely, Miss Marple replied, her voice remaining soft but gaining a sudden steel-like edge. A man is dead, and the inspector is looking at a poor man's accounts instead of a rich man's secrets. It's a very common mistake. People often look at the mud on the shoes rather than the blood on the hands. Sonia recoiled as if she had been slapped, then hurried upstairs, her heels clicking a frantic, irregular rhythm. Miss Marple stood alone in the hallway for a moment. The house felt cold despite the afternoon sun. She knew now that the vicar was merely a convenient distraction, a sacrificial lamb for a much larger predator. The obvious suspect was a mask, and the real face behind the crime was beginning to show its teeth. The afternoon sun began to slant through the tall, narrow windows of the manor, casting long, barred shadows across the oriental rugs. While Inspector Slack continued his loud interrogation of the household staff in the morning room, Miss Marple retreated to the small, sun-drenched alcove near the back stairs. This was a tactical position, one that allowed her to observe the flow of the house without appearing to do so. She was currently occupied with a tangled knot of lavender silk thread, a task that required both patience and a very fine needle. It was exactly the kind of domestic frustration that most people ignored, yet to Miss Marple, a knot was never just a knot, it was a sequence of events that had gone wrong. As she worked, her mind went back to the conservatory. Everyone had been looking at the body of Dr. Thorne, and then at the broken glass, and finally at the vicar. But Miss Marple had been watching the plants. Specifically, she had been looking at the prize-winning begonias. One of the pots had been overturned, but it wasn't the soil that interested her. It was a small, rectangular scrap of heavy vellum paper that had been partially buried in the damp earth, likely dislodged from the doctor's pocket during his final struggle. She had retrieved it while the inspector was busy shouting for a telephone, and now, in the privacy of the alcove, she smoothed it out against her knee. The paper was not a letter, but a fragment of an old parish register entry copied in Dr. Thorne's precise academic hand. It listed a birth from 40 years ago, a child born to a servant at Ravenmoor, with the father's name left conspicuously blank. Beside the entry, Thorne had scribbled a single word in red ink, Reese. To anyone else, the name might mean nothing, but Miss Marple possessed a memory for names that was truly formidable. She remembered a scandal from her youth involving a family named Reese, who had once held a minor title in the north. They were a family plagued by a very specific and rare genetic trait, a peculiar diamond-shaped birthmark on the left temple. She looked up as Gladys, the young parlour-maid she had seen earlier with Sonia Vane, hurried past the alcove. The girl was crying silently, her apron crumpled in her hands. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly. "Oh, Gladys dear, could you spare a moment? My thread has become quite impossible, and young eyes are so much better at these things than mine." The girl stopped dabbing at her eyes and moved toward the alcove. As she reached for the silk, Miss Marple noticed a dark bruise on the girl's wrist, shaped like the firm grip of a hand. "There now, don't fret," Miss Marple said, her voice a soothing hum. "It's a very stressful house today. Miss Vane can be quite demanding when she is anxious, can't she? I believe she was looking for a scarf earlier. A primrose-coloured one?" Gladys let out a small, choked sob. "It wasn't just the scarf, miss. She was looking for a letter. She said if I'd taken it, she'd have me sacked and blacklisted. But I never saw any letters. I only found the scarf behind the radiator in the library, all scorched like someone tried to burn it in the grate and mist." "Behind the radiator," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, "a very clever place to hide something in a hurry. And was the letter she mentioned perhaps inside the scarf?" Gladys nodded quickly. "She thinks so, but the inspector's men have been through everything and they didn't find it either. Now she thinks I've stolen it to blackmail her. As if I'd do such a thing." Miss Marple patted the girl's hand. "Of course you wouldn't, dear. You have a very honest face, just like my niece's girl, Amy. Though Amy did have a habit of putting things in her pockets and forgetting them. Tell me, Gladys, did Dr. Thorne visit the library before he went to the conservatory yesterday?" "He did, miss. He was there for an hour with the captain. They were arguing about something terrible. I heard the captain say, 'It would ruin us both,' and the doctor replied, 'Truth is a bitter pill, Alistair, but I won't have a ghost sitting at my table any longer.'" The girl shivered. "It sounded so spooky, it did. Then the doctor marched out to the conservatory to find Mrs. Derwent, and that was the last I saw of him alive." Miss Marple thanked the girl and let her go. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, revealing a picture far more sinister than a vicar's debts. The ghost the doctor referred to was likely the secret of Rhys' birth, a secret that threatened the very legitimacy of the Derwent line. If Alistair was not the rightful heir, the estate would pass to a distant, unknown branch of the family, leaving both him and his Aunt Clarissa in ruin. Sonia Vane, who was clearly planning to marry the Derwent fortune, had her own desperate reasons to keep that secret buried. The scorched scarf and the hidden vellum fragment were the keys. One suggested an attempt to conceal evidence of presence at the scene, while the other pointed to the motive. But there was one detail that still bothered Miss Marple. Dr. Thorne had been a man of immense caution. He wouldn't have carried the only proof of such a scandal in his pocket during a heated confrontation unless he intended to use it as a shield. And a shield that fails usually means the attacker didn't care about the consequences, or already knew they had nothing left to lose. Miss Marple folded her knitting and stood up. It was time to look closer at Clarissa Derwent's prize-winning roses. The shadows in the library of Ravenmoor Manor seemed to lengthen with an unnatural haste as the afternoon tea was served, though the atmosphere was far from festive. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed wing chair, her presence so unassuming that the other occupants of the room spoke with a reckless lack of caution. It was a phenomenon she had observed many times. People often treated seniors like furniture, forgetting that even the oldest chairs have ears. Across the room, Sonia Vane was pacing a narrow strip of Persian rug, her movements increasingly agitated. She looked like a woman who had spent her life building a house of cards and had just felt the first ominous gust of wind. Clarissa Derwent entered the room, carrying a tray of untouched sandwiches. Her face was a mask of aristocratic composure, but her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere above the mantelpiece. "The inspector has finished with the servants," she announced, her voice brittle. "He is now convinced that the vicar's motive was the misappropriation of the church funds. Apparently Arthur had a weakness for rare stamps, a most expensive hobby for a man of the cloth." She let out a short, hollow laugh. "It's convenient, isn't it? A tidy little motive for a tidy little man." Alistair Derwent, who had been staring out the window at the darkening moors, turned sharply. "It's more than convenient, Aunt Clarissa. It's a godsend. If Slack closes the case, we can finally put this nightmare behind us. The press is already beginning to sniff around the gates." He moved toward the sideboard to pour himself another stiff drink, his hand still sporting the heavy signet ring that Miss Marple had noted earlier. He seemed desperate to believe the inspector's narrative, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something far more visceral than relief. It was the look of a man who knew the cellar was flooding but hoped the water would stay below the floorboards. Miss Marple cleared her throat, the sound small but oddly commanding in the tense room. "Rare stamps are indeed a peculiar passion," she mused, her knitting needles clicking a steady rhythm. "I remember a Mr. Willoughby in St. Mary Mead who spent his entire inheritance on a single misprinted George V penny red. He was quite obsessed, but he was also a man who wouldn't dream of hurting a fly. He used to say that collectors are the most peaceful of men because they live in the past. Dr. Thorne, however, seemed very interested in the present and the future of this estate." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken threats. Sonia Vane stopped her pacing, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Miss Marple. "What are you suggesting, Jane? that the doctor was a blackmailer because that's a very serious accusation to make against a dead man. "Oh, not a blackmailer, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her gaze remaining mild. "More of a historian with a conscience. He was very interested in the Reese family, was he not? It's such a distinctive name. I believe there was a girl, Mary Reese, who worked here as a nursery maid many years ago. She left quite suddenly, if I recall the village gossip correctly. People said she went to the north, but I suspect she never really left the Derwent history." Clarissa's hand shook, and a sandwich slid from the tray, landing silently on the rug. The mention of the name Reese seemed to vibrate through the room like a struck tuning fork. Alistair's glass paused halfway to his lips. It was at this moment that the true map of Ravenmoor's secrets began to reveal itself. Miss Marple watched as the three of them, Clarissa, Alistair, and Sonia, exchanged a look of profound shared terror. It was not the terror of three people who had conspired to kill, but the terror of three people who each suspected the other of the deed, all while being bound together by a single devastating truth. Miss Marple continued as if she hadn't noticed the atmospheric shift. "The thing about history is that it is very difficult to burn. Like that primrose scarf Gladys found behind the radiator, silk doesn't burn easily, you know. It tends to smoulder and leave a very distinctive scent. Much like a secret that has been suppressed for too long, it eventually fills the house until no one can breathe." She looked directly at Sonia Vane. "I believe Gladys did not steal the letter you were looking for, Sonia. I suspect Dr. Thorne took it from the library desk just moments before he went to the conservatory. He likely intended to show it to Clarissa as proof of what he had discovered about the Derwent succession." Sonia's face drained of colour, making her rouge stand out like bruises. "You don't know anything," she hissed, but her voice lacked conviction. "You're just a meddling old woman who likes to make up stories to pass the time." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, beginning a new row of her knitting, "but stories, like weeds, usually have roots, and the roots of this particular story seem to lead directly to the heart of this house. It's quite fascinating how a simple birthmark or a missing parish record can change the course of an entire family's fortune. It makes one realize how fragile our social standing truly is." As she spoke, the front door bell rang, a sharp, insistent sound that made everyone jump. It was the arrival of a second twist, one that would shift the focus of the investigation and prove that the true killer's deception was far more intricate than even the inspector could imagine. The game was no longer about a vicar's debts, it was about the survival of a dynasty, and the next move was about to be played. The sharp ringing of the front doorbell was followed by a commotion in the entrance hall that even the heavy library doors could not muffle. Inspector Slack, who had been on the verge of declaring the case closed against the vicar, emerged from the morning room with a look of profound irritation. He was met by a mud-spattered constable who held a leather satchel aloft, as if it were a captured standard. The news travelled through the house with the speed of a winter chill. A second body had been discovered. This time, the location was the old gatekeeper's lodge at the edge of the estate, and the victim was none other than the manor's reclusive groundskeeper, Silas Moon. Silas had been a fixture at Ravenmoor for 40 years, a man who spoke more to the trees than to the people, yet he was the one person who had seen everyone entering and leaving the estate on the day of the feast. His death appeared, at first glance, to be a tragic accident, a fall down a steep flight of stone stairs. However, the inspector's triumphant expression faltered when the constable whispered that Moon's pockets had been emptied, and a single primrose-coloured silk tassel was found clutched in his lifeless hand. This new revelation sent a shockwave through the drawing-room, and for the first time the suspicion shifted away from the vicar and toward the inner circle of the manor. Miss Marple remained in her chair, her needles clicking with a rhythmic, thoughtful pace. She noted how Sonia Vane's hand flew to her throat, her fingers searching for the missing fringe of the scarf she had so vehemently denied wearing. The deception was beginning to crack, but Miss Marple sensed that this second death was a calculated maneuver. It was designed to look like a desperate move by a panicked killer, but to her eyes it felt too convenient. a classic case of the red herring in the pond, much like the time old Mr. Eberly had staged a burglary to cover up the fact that he had accidentally sold his wife's heirloom brooch. "How very peculiar," Miss Marple remarked to the room at large, though her eyes were fixed on Clarissa Derwent. Silas Moon was a very sure-footed man. He walked those woods in the pitch black of night for decades. To fall down his own stairs on the very night a murder occurs, it's a most remarkable coincidence. In St. Mary Mead we always say that coincidence is just a name for a pattern we haven't recognized yet. Clarissa did not answer. She was staring at the inspector, who was now barking orders to have the gatekeeper's lodge cordoned off. The narrative slack had built around the vicar was crumbling, replaced by a much darker possibility, a serial killer within the house. Alistair Derwent paced the length of the room, his agitation reaching a breaking point. "This is madness. First the doctor, now Silas. Someone is trying to systematically destroy this family." He turned his gaze towards Sonia, his eyes filled with a sudden, sharp distrust. "Sonia, that tassel, you had a scarf that colour. I remember seeing it in the hallway." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Sonia's defence was shrill and immediate, a flurry of denials and counter-accusations that only served to make her appear more guilty in the eyes of the law. Miss Marple watched the exchange with a quiet sadness. She knew that Sonia was a shallow, grasping woman, but she also knew that Sonia lacked the cold, surgical nerves required to push a man down the stairs after already committing a murder in a crowded conservatory. The inspector, sensing a new trail, moved toward Sonia with predatory intent. "Miss Vane, I think you and I should have a very long talk in the library, and I'll be wanting to see that scarf you've been so eager to hide." As they were led away, the house fell into a new kind of silence, a silence of mutual suspicion. Alistair retreated to the shadows of the far corner, and Clarissa sat down, her hands trembling as she picked up a discarded book. The focus had shifted perfectly, just as the killer had intended. By sacrificing Sonia Vane to the inspector's suspicions, the true murderer had bought themselves the one thing they needed most: time. Miss Marple, however, was not looking at the primrose tassel or the inspector's notes. She was thinking about the vellum scrap she had found in the begonia pot. "Reese," she whispered to herself. The second death hadn't been about silencing a witness to the doctor's murder. It had been about silencing the only person left who remembered the birth of a child 40 years ago. Silas Moon had been at Ravenmoor longer than anyone, and he would have known exactly who that child was. The pattern was nearly complete, but it required one final delicate test to bring the hidden truth into the light. The killer was confident, feeling shielded by the chaos they had created, but they had forgotten that Miss Marple didn't look at the chaos. She looked at the person standing perfectly still in the centre of it. The evening air within Ravenmoor Manor had grown heavy with the scent of damp earth and extinguishing candles, a cloying atmosphere that seemed to press against the lungs. With Sonia Vane currently being subjected to Inspector Slack's relentless and loud-mouthed interrogation in the library, a strange hollow peace had settled over the rest of the house. Miss Marple, ever the creature of habit, had not retreated to her room. Instead, she sat in the small conservatory, the very site of the first tragedy, which had now been released by the police but remained shunned by the household. She sat amidst the shadows of the exotic ferns, her knitting needles silent for once, resting in her lap like silver skewers. She was waiting, for she knew that the most dangerous predators often returned to the scene of their success when they felt they were finally unobserved. She did not have to wait long. The faint, rhythmic click of heels on the tile floor announced the arrival of Clarissa Derwent. The mistress of the house moved with a ghostly fluidity, her face illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the glass panes. She did not see Miss Marple at first. She walked straight to the large ornamental pot of begonias where Dr. Thorne had met his end. Clarissa stood there for a long moment, her hand reaching out to touch a leaf, her expression unreadable in the gloom. It was a look of profound weariness, the sort of exhaustion that comes from carrying a weight for 40 years without ever being allowed to set it down. "It is quite remarkable how resilient plants are, Clarissa," Miss Marple said softly, her voice emerging from the shadows like a gentle reprimand. Clarissa jumped, her hand flying to her heart, her breath catching in a jagged sob. "Jane, you frightened me. I thought everyone had gone to bed." Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and stood up, moving into the pool of moonlight. "The mind is very active at night, my dear, especially when it is presented with such a puzzling set of circumstances. I was just thinking about my old friend, Mrs. Partridge. She had a very fine collection of begonias, much like these. She also had a very troublesome nephew who thought he was the rightful heir to her small cottage in St. Mary Mead." Clarissa's eyes narrowed, her body tensing as if she were preparing for a blow. "I don't see what that has to do with us, Jane. The inspector is satisfied that Sonia Vane is responsible for Silas Moon's death, and likely the doctor's as well. She had the scarf, she had the motive of social ambition, and she had the opportunity." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, the scarf is very compelling evidence, almost too convincing. It's like a signpost in a fog. It points very clearly in one direction, which is exactly why I find it so suspicious. You see, Clarissa, Sonia Vane is a greedy woman, but she is also very vain. A woman like that does not leave a tassel from her favourite scarf in a dead man's hand, unless it is placed there by someone else." Miss Marple took a step closer, her blue eyes fixed on Clarissa with a piercing intensity. "And then there is the matter of the Reese family. Such a tragic story. A young girl, a secret child, and a father who could never acknowledge him because it would mean the end of a grand name and a grand fortune. I imagine Dr. Thorne was very proud of discovering that the captain was not a Derwent at all, but the grandson of a nursery maid and a disgraced lord. He probably thought he was doing the right thing by bringing it to you, didn't he? He thought you were a woman of honour who would want the truth to be known." The silence that followed was so absolute that the sound of a distant owl seemed like a thunderclap. Clarissa's face transformed, the brittle mask of the aristocrat finally shattering to reveal a cold, desperate ferocity. "Honour is a luxury for those who have nothing to lose, Jane," she whispered, her voice devoid of its usual tremor. "This house, this name, it is all I have. I have spent my life preserving the Derwent legacy. I would not let a prying old doctor or a drunken gatekeeper tear it down with a scrap of paper and a 50-year-old scandal." Miss Marple sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "I thought as much. It wasn't Alistair who killed the doctor. He hasn't the stomach for it. He only tried to hide the evidence afterward. And it wasn't Sonia. It was you, Clarissa. You used the letter opener because it was familiar. You killed Silas because he was the only witness left to give birth. You even planted the tassel from Sonia's scarf to ensure the inspector looked elsewhere. It was a very clever plan, reminiscent of the way Mrs. Bantry's cook used to hide the scorched cakes at the bottom of the bin." Clarissa's hands curled into claws. "And what will you do, Jane? You have no proof. The inspector has his villain. Who would believe an old woman's stories about nursery maids and birthmarks?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. "Proof is funny, Clarissa. Sometimes it is found in what people say, and sometimes it is found in what they do when they think they are being watched. You see, I haven't been alone in the conservatory tonight." From behind a large palm, Inspector Slack's shadow emerged, his face dark with a mixture of shock and professional triumph. He had heard every word of the confession, drawn out by Miss Marple's subtle psychological game. The trap had been sprung, and the Lady of Ravenmoor was finally caught in the web of her own making. The following morning, the library of Ravenmoor Manor was filled with a cold, unforgiving light that seemed to strip the room of its ancestral grandeur. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace, looking uncharacteristically humbled, while Alistair Derwent sat slumped in a chair, his head buried in his hands. Sonia Vane, recently released from her harrowing ordeal in the interrogation room, stood near the door, her eyes red-rimmed but her spirit already shifting toward a cold, calculating resentment. At the centre of it all, Clarissa Derwent sat perfectly upright, her wrists now bound by the cold steel of the law. Yet her chin remained defiant. Miss Marple sat opposite her, still working on the pink woolen booties, her needles clicking with a soft, persistent sound that provided the only rhythm in the room. "It is a very sad business," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying across the library with the clarity of a church bell. "But as I often say, the truth is like a cork in water. No matter how hard you try to push it down, it will eventually bob back to the surface. You see, Inspector, the mistake everyone made was assuming this was a crime of the present, a matter of debts or simple jealousy. But Ravenmoor is a house built on its history, and it was in that history that the motive lay. Dr. Thorne was a meticulous man, a scientist of social standing. When he discovered the truth about the Rees lineage, he saw it not as a scandal, but as a correction that needed to be made. He believed in the natural order of things, and the natural order dictated that Alistair was not the rightful heir." She turned her gaze toward Alistair, who winced. "You knew, of course. The doctor had confronted you. That is why you were so desperate to find the papers in the library. You even stepped in the soil of the conservatory while trying to check the doctor's pockets after the deed was done, leaving that very distinct mark on your signet ring. But you didn't kill him, Alistair. You have no iron in your blood for it. You merely tried to cover the tracks of the woman who has always protected you." Miss Marple then looked at Clarissa. Clarissa has spent 40 years ensuring that the Derwent name remains untarnished. When she realized Thorne was going to expose the fact that her late brother had fathered a son with a nursery maid, a son whose descendant was the true heir, she did what she has always done. She pruned the garden. The inspector cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "But the scarf, Miss Marple? And the gatekeeper?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. The scarf was a stroke of desperate genius. Clarissa saw Sonia leave it in the hallway earlier that day. After killing the doctor with the letter opener, a weapon she knew exactly where to find on her own desk, she stole the scarf. She intended to burn it, but when she realized the inspector was focusing on the vicar, she kept it as a secondary insurance policy. When Silas Moon began to drop hints about what he remembered from 40 years ago, she knew he had to be silenced. She went to the lodge, pushed him down those treacherous stairs, and placed the tassel from Sonia's scarf in his hand. It was a classic double bluff, Inspector. She made it look like a clumsy mistake by a younger woman, knowing you would find it irresistible. Sonia Vane let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "And to think I wanted to be part of this family." "You're all monsters." Miss Marple ignored the outburst, her focus remaining on the tragic figure of Clarissa. The clue that truly unsettled me, however, was the silver teapot. The day of the feast, Clarissa's hand was trembling. I thought it was age, but then I noticed she only trembled when the doctor was near. It wasn't fear of a man, it was the physical manifestation of a decision already made. And then there was the vellum fragment in the begonia pot. The doctor had written the word Rees in red ink. Red ink is what he used for his most urgent medical cases. To him, the illegitimacy of the Derwent line was a disease that needed to be cured. To Clarissa, it was a secret that needed to be buried in the same ground as the doctor. Clarissa Derwent looked at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with a sudden, haunting clarity. "You always were too observant, Jane. Even at school you noticed the things no one else cared about." Miss Marple paused her knitting, looking down at the soft wool. "People are my hobby, Clarissa. And people, I'm afraid, are remarkably consistent. We all want to protect what we believe belongs to us, but we forget that the price of a secret is often the very soul of the house we are trying to save." As the inspector led Clarissa out toward the waiting police car, the heavy silence of Ravenmoor returned. But it was no longer the silence of a mystery. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a family that had finally run out of lies. Miss Marple folded her knitting, tucked it into her bag, and prepared for the journey back to the relative peace of St. Mary Mead. The departure of the Ravenmoor Manor police cars left a vacuum that was slowly filled by the mundane sounds of the English countryside. The distant lowing of cattle and the sharp cry of a kestrel overhead seemed indifferent to the fall of the Derwent dynasty. Inside the house, the air felt thinner, as if the removal of Clarissa Derwent had allowed the manor to finally exhale a breath it had been holding since the Victorian era. Alistair Derwent remained in the library, staring at the empty silver teapot that still sat on the sideboard, a silent witness to the ruin of his expectations. He was now a man with a name that meant nothing and a fortune that would likely be dismantled by solicitors and the rightful Rees heir in the coming months. Miss Marple stood in the front hall, waiting for her taxi to arrive. Her suitcase, a modest leather affair that had seen many such departures, sat neatly by her feet. Beside her stood Dolly Bantry, who was dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I simply cannot believe it, Jane," Dolly whispered, her voice trembling with the shock of it all. "Clarissa was one of us. To think she could do such things, the doctor, and then poor Silas. It makes one feel as though one doesn't know anyone at all." Miss Marple reached out and patted her friend's hand, with a firm, comforting touch. "On the contrary, Dolly, it shows that we know people very well. We only choose to ignore the parts of them that don't fit into our pleasant afternoon teas. Human nature is quite like a cellar. It doesn't matter how beautiful the drawing room is above. There is always the possibility of damp and rot beneath the floorboards." The taxi pulled up the gravel drive, its engine humming a low, modern rhythm that felt out of place against the ancient stone of the manor. As Miss Marple climbed into the back seat, she looked out the window one last time. She saw Sonia Vane standing on the terrace, already draped in a fur coat that she had likely purchased with Alistair's dwindling credit. Sonia was looking toward the gates, her expression one of sharp, predatory calculation. She would move on to the next estate, the next name, and the next secret, her spirit entirely untouched by the tragedy she had nearly been blamed for. To a woman like Sonia, Ravenmoor was merely a failed investment. As the car wound its way through the narrow lanes of the village, Miss Marple observed the life of Ravenmoor returning to its usual rhythmic pace. The village shop was open, and Mrs. Gable was undoubtedly busy recounting a highly embellished version of the arrest to anyone who would listen. The vicar, Arthur Pringle, was visible in the churchyard, his shoulders hunched as he tended to a row of gravestones. He looked older, more fragile, but there was a peace in his movements that had been absent before. He had been exonerated of murder, even if his reputation for financial incompetence would linger. In a few weeks, the haunting at Ravenmoor would become just another local legend, a story told over pints at the Black Swan to frighten newcomers and entertain the regulars. Miss Marple leaned back against the upholstery and closed her eyes. Her thoughts drifted back to St. Mary Mead and her own garden. She thought of the bindweed that constantly tried to choke her lilies, and how one had to be ruthless with the roots if one wanted the flowers to survive. Clarissa Derwent had tried to do the same, but she had mistaken the flowers for the weeds. She had thought the name was the life of the garden, when in fact it was the people. By killing to preserve a reputation, she had destroyed the very legacy she worshipped. It was a common enough tragedy, one that Miss Marple had seen played out in countless variations over the decades. "Are you quite all right, miss?" the taxi driver asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "You look a bit tired. It must have been a stressful weekend with all that excitement at the big house." Miss Marple opened her eyes and offered a gentle, tired smile. "I'm fine, thanks." It is just that observing human nature can be a very exhausting occupation. One sees so much that one wishes were not there. But then, she added, her eyes brightening with a spark of her usual spirit, one also sees the resilience of the truth. And that is always a very comforting thing to take home. By the time the train pulled into the station near St. Mary Mead, the events at Ravenmoor felt like a story from a distant land. Miss Marple walked along the platform, her knitting bag over her arm, feeling the familiar, comforting embrace of her own village. She knew that by tomorrow she would be hearing about the missing altar cloths or the scandal of the new curate's tie, and she would listen with the same keen attention she had given to a double murder, for in the small and the large the patterns remained the same. Evil was not a grand cinematic force, it was a small, quiet weed that grew in the dark corners of the human heart, waiting for a moment of weakness to take hold. And as long as there were weeds, Miss Marple knew she would never truly be able to put down her knitting.